In the embrace of great Nurgle, I am no longer afraid, for with his pestilential favor, I have become that which I once feared, death.
The Death Guard are one of the traitor legions of Chaos Space Marines. They worship and devote themselves exclusively to the Chaos God Nurgle, and as a result of his mutational gifts, they have become Plague Marines, heretic Astartes who are eternally rotting away within their power armor and infected with every known form of disease and decay, but who are immune to all pain or minor injury. When the 14th Legion was first raised on Terra by the Emperor during the first founding, its Astartes were known as the Dusk Raiders. After the 14th Legion was reunited with its Primarch Mortarion on the world of Barbarus, he renamed the Legion the Death Guard. The Death Guard are a traitor legion entirely steeped in the power of Nurgle, the chaos god of death, disease, and despair, their very essence the epitome of all that vile chaos god stands for. Their bodies are hives of filth and decay, their flesh eternally rotting away, even as it is renewed by the ceaseless process of death and rebirth. Once, however, the Death Guard were the strongest and most resilient of all of the Emperor's Space Marine legions, the inheritors of Primarch Mortarion, in whose genetic image they were created. Mortarion grew to maturity on the world of Barbarus, a planet steeped in a toxic miasma where the human population cowered in the dark lowlands, fearful of the overlords that preyed upon them from their mountaintop, keeps deep within the fog. History does not record who or what these beings truly were, but it is certain they were more than, or at least other than, human. For one, they were able to breathe the deadly gases that made up the atmosphere of Barbarus, getting ever more deadly the higher the altitude, but they are said to have displayed other abilities too. The abominable masters of Barbarus were somehow able to enslave or dominate the flesh of the dead, and they preyed upon the cringing natives in the valleys below, ever needful of raw material to fuel the endless wars they fought against one another. The infant Primarch was raised by one such overlord, Nekar, the greatest of them all, who taught him the ways of war, yet would not answer his questions regarding the people who dwelled in the lowlands. When Mortarion defied his master and descended through the fog, which as a superhuman Primarch he could breathe, he found people, like himself, if weaker and existing in perpetual terror of the overlords who preyed upon them each night. Though they were initially suspicious of him, Mortarion proved himself one of their kind, and molded them into an army that at first defied the hunting parties of the overlords, and then turned the tables upon them. At length, the only one left was he who had been Mortarion's master, the High Overlord Nekar, residing so high in the toxic strata that not even Mortarion could pursue him. When the Emperor came to Barbarus, the people greeted him as their savior, yet Mortarion was jealous and resentful of the adulation heaped upon this perfect stranger. Though his people could see that the Emperor was the Primarch's sire, he himself saw only the differences. Where the stranger was noble of form and tanned of skin, Mortarion was pale and gaunt. When Mortarion refused to join him, the Master of Mankind issued Mortarion a challenge. If the Primarch could defeat the last overlord of Barbarus, the Emperor would depart. If he could not, Mortarion must accept his fate and join the Great Crusade. Mortarion accepted the Emperor's challenge and ascended into the toxic clouds, higher than he had ever traveled before. At length, he reached the grim keep of Nekar and raged for the High Overlord to face him. Yet, even the Primarch's superhumanly enhanced body could not withstand the toxic concentration of the atmosphere at that altitude, but as he succumbed with Nekar about to slay him, he saw the golden figure of the Emperor step between him and the High Overlord, entirely unaffected by the poisonous air. With a single stroke of his mighty flaming blade, the Emperor felled the last overlord of Barbarus, and Mortarion acceded to his fate. Yet the Primarch found himself riddled with anger and resentment at his gene-father for stealing away what he believed to be his rightful vengeance. Once the Primarch was united with his legion, it was found that the Death Guard, as they were renamed by their new master in memory of the army of the same name he had led against the overlords on Barbarus, were amongst the most resolute and resilient of all the legions. Mortarian's warriors were ever to be found at the center of the battle line, their strength and determination the inheritance of their Primarch, making them the unbreakable core of any army of galactic conquest. When the Horus Heresy plunged the galaxy into civil war, and Mortarion joined himself and his legion to the rebellion of the War Master Horus out of his unresolved anger at the Emperor, the warriors of the Death Guard found themselves becalmed in the warp on their way to the siege of Terra and assailed by warp-born plagues so virulent that not even their legendary resilience could withstand them. Soon, the entire legion was beset by a sickness that bloated their bellies with corpse gas, caused flesh to slough from their bodies, and made these strongest and toughest of warriors into crippled wretches assailed by delirium. Though none can say exactly what forces acted upon the soul of the Primarch of the Death Guard, whether he was already damned or whether he made his pact in some state of fever, he called out for deliverance, and his call must have been answered. When finally the Death Guard Legion's fleet emerged from the warp, its vessels and its warriors were entirely changed. Their once gleaming white and gray armor was stained with filth, and the noble warriors were transformed into walking hives of death and abomination. Worse still, the plague marines of the Death Guard were now hosts for the most virulent afflictions that their new patron, the plague god Nurgle, could concoct. Condemned to a deathless state of eternal decay, the Death Guard would spread their pestilent diseases the length and breadth of the galaxy for the greater glory of chaos. With the end of the Horus Heresy, Mortarion led his legion into the Eye of Terror, and while others had splintered into countless war bands, the Death Guard remained largely whole, thanks in no small part to their legendary strength and resilience. Mortarion brought them to a world that would become known simply as the Plague Planet, which he molded into a new and despicable form, making it a virtual copy of Lost Barbarus. To this day, Mortarion's Death Guard launch their assaults through the Cadian Gate and into the galaxy beyond, sometimes in large bodies and at others lending strength to allied chaos forces. Wherever they travel, they spread the joyful, exuberant poxes of Nurgle, gifting those who would know eternal life with the choicest of the plague god's blessings. There have been numerous occasions when previously unknown plagues have swept the defense lines of otherwise static Imperial fronts, followed solar hours later by an overwhelming enemy advance. Many amongst the Imperial High Command ascribe such instances to the Death Guard and are fearful of what vile diseases they might concoct next. The Emperor of Mankind sought to unite all of humanity under one banner, following the long night of the Age of Strife, and end interhuman conflict. Once united, the Emperor intended to begin the next stage of his great plan, to ensure human domination of the Milky Way galaxy, which he judged to be necessary if humanity was to survive the never-ceasing threats to its existence embodied by chaos, myriad Xenos races, and its own fragile human nature. In time, when the Emperor's eye first began to fall beyond Terra, he began to raise new armies to fight his Great Crusade. He drew these new troops in part from the forces that had already unified Terra during the unification wars of the late 30th millennium. To carry out the Great Crusade and reunite all the scattered colony worlds of mankind beneath the single banner of the Imperium of Man, the Emperor created the genetically enhanced transhuman warriors of the Space Marine Legions. These forces would serve as the spear tip of his Great Crusade that began in CI 800 M30, bringing the light of the Imperial truth and enforcing Imperial compliance with the new regime on every human world encountered. The origins of the Dusk Raiders can be found during the Unification Wars. The base human stock for the majority of the first Space Marine legions to be raised came from Terra, and in the case of the 15th Legion, the main bulk of the gene recruits used were drawn from the ancient and warlike clans of the islands of Old Albia on the continent of Europa. Indeed, such was the suitability of their peoples for induction into the ranks of the Space Marines that recruits were drawn also to fill the ranks of the first founding Vabishanith and Exth Legions, the Night Lords and the Iron Hands, respectively. Although this was to a lesser degree than the recruitment done there by the 15th Legion, which was by blood and culture shaped by the warlords and techno-barbarians of Albia, as well as the hand of the Emperor. The recruitment of the Sons of Albia served a twofold purpose. Firstly, and most importantly, it drew off the cream of whole generations of strength from a Terran realm, now friend and ally to the Imperium, but never fully trusted. For old Albia, towering amid the northern Atlan wilderness, had once been a true rival of the Emperor for control of the destiny of mankind. By recruiting their brightest and best into the Legiones Astartes and the other growing imperial organizations marked for war amid the stars, the Emperor ensured they could never threaten the unification from within. Secondly, it subsumed into the Emperor's forces all the martial traditions and bloodlines that had for centuries held much of Terra under their cruel grasp, and had eventually overcome the Pan-Pacific Empire under the rule of its unspeakable king, Narthan Doom. Such a breed of relentless warlords and soldier scientists was an invaluable resource that the Emperor was loath to waste. By the time the Unification Wars had begun, the warlord clans of Old Albia had thrown off the tyranny of the last descendants of the unspeakable king, and did not readily bend their knee to the Emperor, for they refused to have another master in Doomi's place. Instead, the Albians met the Emperor's regiments of Thunder Warriors with their own battalions of steam-belching proto-dreadnoughts and heavily armored Ironside soldiers. In battle after battle, the forces of the Unification were held in check, although at a shattering cost for the Albians, who would not give in despite the Imperial onslaught. Impressed with the Albians' martial temper and indomitable courage, the Emperor called for a ceasefire and sought victory over the warlord clans through peaceful negotiations, understanding that to crush them by force alone would entail a grinding war of attrition that would only serve to decimate his own forces and gain him naught but a handful of ashes as a prize of war. The Emperor pursued peace despite the protestations of his human counselors and generals. Going before them, it is said, unarmed and clothed in white and crimson, the Emperor spoke to the warlords' parliament and laid before them his vision of a future mankind reunited and ascendant, of tyrants toppled and nightmares slain. He offered them glory amongst the stars, and most importantly, redemption for many hundreds of years of kinslaying and bloodshed. To the shock of many, the warlords of Old Albia accepted the Emperor's vision. In doing so, the Albian clans became among the Unification's most zealous supporters, although still untrusted by many, lending their warriors and secrets long kept up for the Emperor's eyes alone. Most importantly for the future of humanity, the Albians sacrificed their sons to become the first Space Marines. The 15th Legion quickly developed in the use of tactics and methods of warfare that their Ironside forebears would have found utterly familiar, matched with a stoic temperament and gene-crafted aptitude which few doubted had been the Emperor's design all along. Operating in the role of heavy infantry, the Astartes of the 14th Legion were experts at survival and endurance, and quickly gained a reputation among the other newly forged legions as relentless and disciplined fighters. In defense, they were stubborn and indefatigable, able to stand unwaveringly against the heaviest fire and hold their position against all comers to the last living body and bolter shell if needed. In attack, they systematically destroyed a given target, crashing upon an enemy in wave after wave of armored bodies, excelling in close-range firefights and bloody attrition. Their gray and unadorned power armor began to carry the symbols of rank and decoration, now modified that once formed the armorial imagery of the Ironsides of Old Albia, and most tellingly their right vambraces, gauntlets, and shoulder plates were painted the deep crimson of drying blood, now symbolizing the red right hand of the Emperor's justice, where once it had proclaimed the murderous reach of the Pan-Pacific Empire's unspeakable king. As the 14 Legion fought in the last days of Terran unification and the first battles of the Great Crusade off-world, they were given the epithet of Dusk Raiders by those they fought and took it for their own. This name was a consequence of their use of the ancient Albion tactic of conducting major ground attacks at fall of night, when the shift of light confused an enemy's watch, and gathering darkness would shadow an advance across open ground. Such was the reputation the 14 Legion garnered, in fact, that foes given an ultimatum of attack by the Dusk Raiders would often waver in their resolve, their soldiers panicking and deserting their bastions or throwing down their arms and fleeing at the coming of darkness rather than face the Astartes. As relentless as they were in attack, the Dusk Raiders were known to be honorable opponents as well, who would hold to bargains struck for early surrender and honor symbols of truce. When such terms lapsed, however, and the die was cast for destruction, it was just as widely known that nothing would stay the Dusk Raiders' hand. Such honorable terms only extended to human foes worthy to be brought into the fold of Imperial compliance, however. To the degenerate, the mutant, and the alien, no such mercy was given. So the Dusk Raiders continued this course over the next 8 solar decades as they fought on unwavering in the service of the Great Crusade. Still fatherless during this time as other Space Marine legions gained their long-lost Primarchs, until only a handful remained to be discovered, this orphan status further bred a self-reliance and a quiet, stubborn pride in the Dusk Raiders' self-forged character, and the martial triumphs of the Aftian 6th Legion were many and enviable. Their reunification with their Primarch, though, when it finally came, was not to be the happy event that many had long hoped for, but instead it was to be a pall that fell across the Legion, and under its shadow the Dusk Raiders were broken down and remade, and only the Death Guard remained. When the 20 gestating Primarchs of the Space Marine Legions were scattered across the galaxy through the warp from the Emperor of Mankind's secret gene laboratory deep beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra in a mysterious accident likely caused by the ruinous powers of chaos, one came to rest on the planet Barbarus, a feral world located in the Segmentum Tempestus that was wreathed in poisonous fog. The population of the world was split into 2 groups. The controlling, apparently Xenos overlords, who were necromancers who possessed fantastic psychic powers, along with the human settlers, who had been trapped on the planet millennia before, and were now forced to eke out an existence in the poison-free valleys of the planet, fearing the wrath of the overlords and their undead and mutant creations. The Primarch child was taken in by the most powerful of the overlords, the High Overlord Nakar, who found him amongst the corpses of a battlefield, screaming and wailing where a normal human child would have suffocated and died long before. The High Overlord of Barbarus took the child in with the intention of creating a son and heir, naming him Mortarion, the Child of Death. Mortarion was kept in a fortress positioned at the limit of even his superhuman tolerance to the toxins in the air, while the High Overlord moved his own mans to the highest peak of the world, beyond where even Mortarion could go. He trained the child, who had a highly keen intellect and voracious appetite for knowledge. Mortarion learned everything from battle doctrine to arcane secrets, from artifice to stratagem. However, the young Primarch's questions began to turn towards subjects the High Overlord did not want to talk about, namely the pitiful creatures in the valleys that the many other overlords preyed upon for corpses to reanimate and bodies to corrupt. Finally, knowing he would be unable to find the answers he desired from his adoptive father, Mortarion was forced to break out of the fortress that had been his home and prison when he chose to save a caravan of humans who were being brought up from the valleys below to serve as experimental subjects for Nakar's horrific experiments. After killing several undead golem guards stationed at the gates of the fortress, Mortarion, guided by one of those he had saved, Callus Typhon, headed for the valleys of Barbarus. Breaking through the poisonous mists, Mortarion discovered that the prey of the overlords were in fact the same species as he, and he swore to deliver them from their oppression. The people of Barbarus were slow to accept this pale, gaunt stranger from the mountains, but Mortarion was given a chance to prove his worth when mutant creatures enthralled to another warlord attacked the village. Seeing that the peasants were unable to effectively fight back, Mortarion joined the fray, wielding a massive harvesting scythe that made short work of the beasts. The overlord smiled when Mortarion advanced upon him and withdrew to the apparent safety of the deadly fog, only to be pursued and butchered by this inhumanly resilient Primarch. Accepted into the village without further reservation, Mortarion began to train the villagers in the art of warfare. Soon, representatives from other villages journeyed to learn from Mortarion, while the villages scattered across the valleys of the world were transformed into strongpoints. Mortarion traveled from settlement to settlement, teaching, building, and defending his people. He recruited the toughest, most resilient men and women he could find, forming them into small units that trained under his supervision. He enlisted the aid of blacksmiths, craftsmen, and artificers to create special suits of armor that would allow men to travel through the poisonous fog. As each battle in the mists was fought, Mortarion and his Death Guard would learn how to better adapt the armor and themselves to reach the more poisonous heights. Eventually, only one peak denied them access, the one on which Mortarion's adoptive father Nakare had made his home. Despite his adoptive father being a ruthless necromancer, Mortarion felt reluctant to attack the being who took him in and called off the planned attack. Returning to the village, Mortarion's mood darkened when he found his people talking not of his victory, but of the arrival of a benevolent stranger who promised salvation to the people of Barbarus. Finding this stranger in conference with the village elders of his capital, Mortarion claimed that his people needed no outside help to slay their last oppressor. The stranger commented that even Mortarion and his Death Guard were having trouble pacifying the final Overlord and offered a challenge. If Mortarion could defeat the High Overlord, the stranger would leave. If not, Mortarion had to swear fealty to the stranger and the Imperium of Man he represented. Ignoring the protests of his Death Guard, Mortarion left alone to confront his adoptive father, motivated by a compulsion to prove himself to the stranger below, and also prove once and for all that he was better than Nakare, who had often belittled him while growing up. The confrontation was brief. The air surrounding the High Overlord's fortress was so poisonous that parts of Mortarion's special protective armor began to rot. He collapsed at the gates of the High Overlord's citadel, bellowing challenges. The final thing Mortarion saw before he passed out was Nakar coming to kill him, then the stranger leaping between the two and slaying the High Overlord with a single flaming sword thrust. When he recovered, Mortarion swore fealty to the stranger, who revealed himself to be Mortarion's true gene father, the Emperor of Mankind. The Emperor granted Mortarion command of the 14th Space Marine Legion, then known as the Dusk Raiders, who quickly adopted the name and regalia of Mortarion's original Death Guard. However, the Emperor's slaying of his adoptive father proved to be a grudge Mortarion long held against his true father, for he had desired above all else to end the tyrant's life himself and prove himself the better. When the Emperor took the chance to earn vengeance away from Mortarion, a seed of hatred and blame was placed within his heart that would in time blossom into rank betrayal.
You are my unbroken blades. You are the Death Guard. By your hand shall justice be delivered, and doom shall stalk 1,000 worlds.
True to his oath, Mortarion bent his knee to his newfound father as soon as he was sufficiently recovered to do so, although his final act of defiance on Barbarus would leave scars upon him both physical and mental that would never fully heal. A skilled warlord in his own right, Mortarion was immediately given command of the 14th Legion, which carried his genetic inheritance, and did so on his own terms. Gathering them before him, a grim and spectral figure robed and bearing the great black scythe that had once belonged to his nightmarish foster father, it must have seemed to the Terran-born Dusk Raiders that an ancient graven image of the Grim Reaper had come before them as their new master. His words were simple and delivered in a harsh whisper that nevertheless carried to each and every one. You are my unbroken blades. You are the Death Guard. By your hand shall justice be delivered, and doom shall stalk 1,000 worlds. The Legion's name was then changed in accordance with this decree, and Mortarion's words were engraved above the airlock door of the battle barge Reaper's scythe in honor of that moment. By this simple decree, the Dusk Raiders were no more, and the records and annals from that day forward would carry this new name as one to strike fear into the hearts of mankind's enemies. The 14 legions Astartes had been primarily Terran-born before Mortarion joined the Legion. After that time, almost all of the Legion's neophytes were drawn from the feral world of Barbarus, beginning with the young Kalas Typhon, who had long served as Mortarion's chief lieutenant during his wars against the Overlords and now became the Legion's first captain. This changed the culture and traditions of the Legion, so much so that by the last days of the Great Crusade in the early 31st millennium, there were increasing tensions between the Barbarus-born Astartes and the Terran minority who remained in the Legion and who remembered the Dusk Raiders' earlier martial traditions brought out of old Earth. These tensions became most clear in the period directly preceding the first battle of the Horus Heresy at Istvan III, when approximately one-third of the Legion was judged by Mortarion to be likely to remain loyal to the Emperor when the Legion joined the War Master Horus in his rebellion against the Imperium. Many of these loyalist Death Guard Astartes were Terrans, former Dusk Raiders like Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the 7th Great Company, whose loyalty to the Emperor outweighed their devotion to their Primarch.
Say what you like about the 14th Legion. They are mean, ugly bastards, but tenacious. There's no one else I'd rather have by my side in a war of attrition, and almost anyone else I'd rather have against me.
In the solar decades that followed, the renamed 15th Legion fought tirelessly in the service of the Great Crusade. Never relenting in battle beneath their Primarch's gaze, they pursued the liberation of mankind with a fervor the Great Crusade had never known. Their restless fleet plowed the cold void from one campaign to the next, resupplying on the move, never pausing but to make war. The Death Guard did not garrison, they did not build, they only tore down and slew, coldly, determinedly, and with the inexorable progress of a contagion or a tsunami wave, and worlds fell before them. Over time, Mortarion shaped the creed and practice of the Death Guard, his beliefs in many ways forming a natural extension of their own, beliefs and doctrine becoming ever more refined and extreme. At the heart of them was the unshakable determination that mankind should be free of oppression and terror. Such freedom could only be won in the Primarch's mind by destroying those that would shackle and devour humanity. This was a war to be fought without mercy or limit, without restraint or relenting. The battle for the human future was one that could only be won by enduring any hardship, no matter how terrible, and not shirking from any act, no matter how savage in pursuit of victory. This single end, the liberation of humanity to Mortarion's creed, justified any means. Mortarion took command of his new army with proprietorial severity. Though he was cold and aloof towards his sons, they worshipped him unquestioningly and followed his teachings to the letter. Mortarion saw in them an opportunity to continue his labors upon Barbarus. He would forge the Death Guard into perfect infantrymen, adaptable and self-reliant warriors who specialized in the use of durable weaponry that was easily maintained and resupplied. The Death Guard were taught to choose the best ground, and then to grind their enemies down upon it with massed infantry formations. They were the anvil to their allies' hammers, or else the bludgeon that battered the foe into submission. Some amongst Mortarion's brother Primarchs disparaged his tactics as blunt and unimaginative. In truth, the doctrines of the Death Guard were durable and efficient, and demonstrated a remarkable talent for grassroots martial organization that earned the Death Guard a truly impressive honor roll of victories during the Great Crusade. Mortarion's gene seed made his sons hardy. Through his swiftly imposed regimens of toxin hardening and extreme environment tempering, the former Dusk Raiders became more durable than ever. This inherent toughness only increased, for Mortarion recruited the bulk of his new legionaries from Barbarus. The Death Guard were rightly proud of their indomitable physiology. They deployed into the most hazardous war zones where even other Space Marines hesitated to tread and made widespread use of rad and phosphex weapons, alongside prescribed viral agents that soon earned them something of a dark reputation amongst their brothers. Mortarion cared not for the distaste of his peers. His personal mission was the overthrowing of tyrants, beings such as the Carian Lords of Barbarus, and he took pride that his sons could employ their own rugged strength to defend those too weak to protect themselves. Still, for all their achievements, the labors of the Death Guard went largely unrecognized. Mortarion was far closer to his brother Horus than to his sire the Emperor, believing that the former recognized his worth far better than the latter ever would. Worse, the longer they fought to shield the weak from oppression, the more the Death Guard became overly enamored of their own fortitude and dismissive of those too weak to protect themselves. Decades of endless battle changed the Death Guard, and over time the Terran influences on the Legion became less and less apparent, with the panoply and traditions of the Dusk Raiders and the Officio Militares erased in favor of Barbarus's bleak creed of war. The bare ivory-gray unpainted ceramite that Mortarion favored for the Legion's power armor became increasingly less adorned, save for new murky jade markings set to echo the corrosive-resistant swamp mud applied to coat the iron plates of the human warriors that had once served the Primarch of Barbarus and shorn of older heraldry and Terran influence. The martial stratifications of Old Earth's war masters were done away with too, and eventually the Legion's Librarius was disbanded thanks to Mortarion's hatred of witchery, such as that the hated charnel masters of Barbarus had once wielded. Mortarion's hand and mind was at work everywhere remaking his Legion, from changing tactical doctrines to equipment procurement, and, some say, behind the selection of candidates and changing practices in the Legion's Apothecarian, where he gained the latter knowledge to interfere. With the prevailing conditions on Barbarus and the foul beings that more than likely still stalked the planet's fog-shrouded mountains and deep swamps, there were whispers that the human population that remained would have been better off if they had been euthanized or displaced to a cleaner world for the sake of the sanity of future generations. Mortarion would have none of this, for Barbarus now belonged to his people, bought and paid for by generations of blood and terror, and its strongest sons would now serve as recruits for his new Death Guard. As for the purely human Death Guard that had once fought for him against the overlords of Barbarus, many now became the masters of that world, and a dread aristocracy they soon became, while the youngest and strongest took full or partial conversion into the Legiones Astartes, heedless of the high fatality rate that late induction carried with it, deemed a small enough price to pay to continue in the service of Mortarion, their savior. With new recruitment at issue, Barbarus itself in a short span of years became little more than a factory of sorts to produce new recruits for the Death Guard Legion, and intake from other sources of recruitment to which the Legion had title dwindled to a mere handful, unless the pressure of fatalities in the field proved too great. Mortarion's resistance to the use of bloodstock other than that of Barbarus wavered only because of the need to keep his Legion's strength battle-worthy in his eyes. Recruitment solely from Barbarus was however aided by the high suitability of the planet's hardy feral population to the conversion process. The Legion's gene seed seemed to amplify the uncommonly resistance to contagion and toxins in its Barbarus candidates to unheard-of levels. As fresh intakes of new Space Marines came in from Barbarus, the surviving core of Terran blood became a minority as the Great Crusade burned on across the stars, the Death Guard at the forefront of the fighting in the most hellish war zones imaginable. Although second perhaps in their father's eyes, the Terran contingent remained stubborn in the ranks, hardened veterans and a force to be reckoned with in the Legion. With the Legion drawing the majority of its neophytes from Barbarus, this changed the culture and traditions of the Legion, so much so that by the last days of the Great Crusade in the early 31st millennium, there were increasing tensions between the Barbarus-born Astartes and the Terran minority who remained in the Legion and who remembered the Dusk Raiders' earlier martial traditions brought out of Old Terra. These tensions became most clear in the period directly preceding the first battle of the Horus Heresy at Istvan III, when approximately one-third of the Legion was judged by Mortarion to be likely to remain loyal to the Emperor when the Legion joined the War Master Horus in his rebellion against the Imperium. Many of these loyalist Death Guard Astartes were Terran-born, former Dusk Raiders like Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the 7th Great Company, whose loyalty to the Emperor outweighed their devotion to their Primarch. Mortarion believed that victory in battle came through sheer resilience, and Horus, who used the strengths and weaknesses of the different legions to create the most efficient fighting force possible, used his legion in coordination with Mortarion's frequently. Mortarion and the Death Guard would draw out the enemy and tire them down, and then the Luna Wolves would strike. This combat tactic worked brilliantly, and Mortarion grew close to Horus. The Lord of Death was a grim and driven Primarch, his breathing apparatus and great scythe an inseparable component of his aspect. The pallid, hairless Primarch was viewed by others as a freak, and was distant from all his brother Primarchs save Horus and Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter. Some even whispered that Mortarion was more loyal to Horus than he was to the Emperor. However, the Emperor claimed that loyalty to Horus was de facto loyalty to the Emperor, for the two were that close. Events would prove the Emperor sorely mistaken. When the War Master Horus turned to chaos, it did not require much effort to drag Mortarion and his Death Guard Legion down with him. Horus had been one of the few Primarchs with whom Mortarion had felt comfortable, and as such, he showed more loyalty to the War Master during the Great Crusade than to the Emperor himself. In addition to this, First Captain Callus Typhon, Mortarion's right-hand man, had long been a secret follower of the ruinous powers and eagerly manipulated the rest of the Death Guard into treading the path of damnation. Mortarion revealed his true colors during the scouring of Istvan the Thur, when he willingly sent potentially loyalist elements of the Death Guard, almost one-third of his legion, into Horus's trap. Once the Astartes who remained loyal to the Emperor were purged, the Death Guard then fought alongside their traitor brethren during the drop site massacre on Istvan V. During the subsequent assault on Terra itself, the Death Guard were part of Horus's invasion force. However, en route, the entire Death Guard fleet became trapped in the Immaterium due to the actions of First Captain Callus Typhon, trapping them in a perpetual nightmare. It was whilst on campaign with the Word-Bearers Legion earlier in the Great Crusade that Typhon had learned of a different path for the Legiones Astartes to follow, a future where his hard-won but hidden psychic abilities would be a source of greatness instead of a taboo to be hidden from sight. The foremost chaplain of the Word-Bearers, Erebus, inducted Typhon into the secrets of the Seven-Pillared Lodge, one of the warrior lodges based on the beliefs of the feral peoples of Davin that had begun to spread throughout the Space Marine legions in the later days of the Great Crusade. It was during this time that Typhon caught a glimpse of what the Space Marines could truly become if they shrugged off the yoke of the Emperor's ambitions. Perhaps Typhon's revelation was instrumental in Mortarion's own fall to the ruinous powers. Perhaps Mortarion would have walked a dark path on his own. Either way, the troubled Death Guard Primarch saw a worthy master in Horus, whereas in the Emperor he saw only a self-serving and pompous pretender who had stolen Mortarion's hard-won kingship over Barbarus in a single solar day. As the heresy that Horus initiated slowly but surely escalated into a galactic civil war, Mortarion ordered his fleet to head for Terra with all haste, intending for the Death Guard to join the other traitor legions in the destruction of the false Emperor. By this point, Callus Typhon served one master alone, and it was not his Primarch. Typhon had seen to it that the fleet's navigators were killed to a man after concocting a tale that they were traitors who had been receiving messages from Malcador the Sigillite, but reassured Mortarion that the psychic abilities he possessed would see them through their journey in the Empyrean safe enough. Though he hated the concept of relying on witchery, Mortarion was left with little choice. The Death Guard fleet made transition into the warp, and in the process damned themselves to an eternity of war as the puppets of a foul and ancient god. In leading the Death Guard into the warp, Typhon had delivered them into the clutches of his new master, Nurgle, the Lord of Decay. The strange tides of the Empyrean are notoriously fickle, and during their voyage the entire Death Guard fleet was becalmed. As their warships lingered, directionless and without hope, the cloying influence of Father Nurgle began to take hold. The Death Guard were subjected to the terrible infection of the Destroyer Plague and Nurgle's Rot, as Nurgle's power managed to infiltrate the vessels of the 14 Legion. It polluted the mechanisms of the vessels themselves as easily as it did the transhuman warriors within. Before long, fat devil flies buzzed through the thickening miasma inside each warship. Where they bit at the desperate warriors trapped within, flesh turned to suppurating jelly. The demon venom of their stings caused flesh to blossom into hard new growths. Bellies distended and eyes ran like cracked eggs. Even power armor melded and flowed into strange new shapes. Here, the superhuman resilience of the Death Guard proved their enemy, for they could not simply die. Instead, they were slowly, sickeningly transformed into Plague Marines, their souls claimed by Nurgle in exchange for a permanent release from their pain and suffering. Typhon, having orchestrated this grand corruption, was rewarded most of all. Swelling in size, his skin and armor became one. Great funnels of pestilential bone burst from his body. Into these poured thousands of Nurgle's demon flies, gnawing him from the inside out until his rotten shell teemed and heaved with squirming life. Typhon became a great hollow colony of disease-carrying insects. The bone funnels that sprouted from his back coughed black decay as Nurgle's servants regurgitated the psychic energies pulsing through what was left of his herald's body. Typhus, Chaos Lord and host of the Destroyer Hive, had been born, most blessed and most cursed of all his repugnant kin. Since that bygone era, Typhus has visited 100,000 diseases upon the Imperium of Man. The Destroyer Plague is without doubt the most virulent of all, though fortunately its vector of demonic insects means that it is of limited use when infecting entire star systems. There was nothing so terrifying to Mortarion and the Space Marines of the Death Guard than watching the plague render their legendary resilience meaningless. The pestilence raced through the entire fleet, roiling in their guts, bloating and distending their superhuman bodies, transforming them into horrible, pustulant grotesques. They were made corrupt within and sickening to behold without. They grew sicker by the solar minute, their incredible transhuman constitution their worst enemy as their bodies refused to die, and they were racked with the agony of their macabre transformation. What they endured was unimaginable, and none suffered worse than Mortarion. Whether he perceived in those terrible hours the loss of what he had once stood for, and the damnation he had wrought upon himself and his legion, only Mortarion will ever know. Unable to endure any longer, Mortarion offered his soul and those of all his sons to the Immaterium in exchange for deliverance from eternity, trapped within the twisting corridors of warp space in constant, unendurable pain. A presence answered, as though it had been waiting all along. In the depths of the warp, the great god Nurgle, Lord of Decay and Father of Disease, claimed the Death Guard for his own. What emerged from the warp when the Death Guard fleet broke out into real space bore little resemblance to that which had entered. The gleaming ivory armor and jade heraldry of the once proud Imperial champions was no more. In its stead was a sickly pall of greenish hue. Bloated and corpulence replaced the sleek, proud form of the Death Guard Astartes, as every warrior was now pockmarked with boils, scabs, and putrescent sores. Maggots writhed in their unhealing wounds, and the air about them was clouded with swarming bloated black flies. They bore the foul stink of corruption. Even their weapons and war machines had been mutated, and were now powered by the sickly sorcery of the Plague God, glowing with lambent green warp energy and oozing gangrenous pus. The Death Guard were now walking pestilence carriers. They had become the first Plague Marines. Mortarion himself was also changed, growing taller and more gaunt, as if stretched on a rack. In return for rescue from the torments of the demonic plague, Nurgle had set him on the path to demonhood and transformed Mortarion into Nurgle's greatest demonic servant, the Prince of Decay, the very image of death. Condemned to a deathless state of decay, the Death Guard would spread their pestilent diseases the length and breadth of the galaxy for the greater glory of chaos. In the end, Horus was ultimately defeated by the Emperor and cast down during the Siege of Terra, But unlike the other legions who splintered and fled into the Eye of Terror, Mortarian's legion made an orderly withdrawal, force after force breaking themselves on the super-raiding warriors of the Death Guard. Mortarian led his forces in an ordered formation back into the Eye of Terror. Mortarian claimed the demon world known as the Plague Planet as his new homeworld, and it proved to be an ideal base for launching attacks from out of the Eye into the physical universe. He shaped it so well that Nurgle soon promoted him to become the greatest of his demon princes. Mortarian had finally gotten what he wanted, a world of his own. He ruled over a toxic death world of poison, horror, and misery. But for better or worse, the Death Lord had come home. Some of Mortarian's sons embraced their new form, believing in their arrogance that they had passed through the eye of the needle and proved themselves the only mortals worthy of Nurgle's patronage. Others hated the plague that had laid them low, the weakness it implied. For these warriors, nothing would suffice but to spread ruin and sickness until the entire galaxy was brought down to their level. Others still were driven quite mad, taking on aspects of rambunctious glee or morose entropic misery. Whatever the case, the Death Guard had become Nurgle's servants, body and soul, forevermore. In the millennia of war that followed, their devotion to their rancid deity would only deepen further. Within the Eye of Terror, Mortarian's plague planet was soon molded into a virtual copy of Barbarus, save this time he had taken up his adoptive father Nakar's position as its chief tyrant. Mortarian is still alive in the 41st millennium, only recently re-emerging into real space for the first time since the heresy to lead the assaults of the Death Guard on the realm of Ultramar during the Plague Wars of the Era Indomitus. To this day, Mortarian's Death Guard launches its assaults through the Cadian Gate and into the galaxy beyond, sometimes in large bodies and at others lending strength to allied chaos forces. Wherever they travel, they spread the joyful, exuberant poxes of Nurgle, gifting those who would know eternal life with the choicest of the Plague God's blessings. Typhon, now called Typhus the Traveler, took a more active role in continuing the war against the Imperium by abandoning his master and striking out on his own, bringing the gifts of his patron to the Emperor's followers. Typhus was especially active during the 13 Black Crusade, securing his own plague-ridden stronghold by the end of that conflict. The Plague Wars were an attempt by the demonic and heretic Astartes forces of the Chaos God Nurgle, including the demon Primarch Mortarian and his Death Guard traitor Legion, to conquer the realm of Ultramar and add it to the Plague God's growing realm in real space. The Plague Wars began at some point after the birth of the Great Rift and the onset of the Noctis Aeterna, and ended in Sao 111, M42, after the Primarch Roboot Guilliman successfully ended his Indomitus crusade and brought Imperial reinforcements to defend Ultramar. There is some debate amongst Imperial circles as to precisely when the Plague Wars began, or indeed which war zones they encompass. As with all the great works of Nurgle, this sprawling conflict has waxed and waned, undergoing periods of festering incubation and temporary remission before flaring to life again, just as the warriors of the Imperium of Man believed that victory was finally theirs. Even the origins of the Plague Wars are debated by the historiators of Ultramar, with the earliest accounts of hostilities claimed to have taken place even before the Great Rift split the stars. Whatever the truth, it is known that the Plague Wars, as the Imperium understands them, have stretched across not only Ultramar, where the forces of Nurgle have assailed the sons of Guilliman time and again, but also the star systems to the galactic north of the Ultramarine stellar realm, now known as the Scourge Stars. It was amongst these formerly prosperous worlds that diseases such as the crawling pustulence, eye rot, the plague that walks, and the oozing pox erupted in riotous profusion after the Great Rift opened. Imperial defense lines were overrun by wave upon wave of trudging plague demons and fanatical chaos cultists. Corrupt demagogues spewed filth and falsehoods that saw planetary defense force regiments turn upon their former comrades before joining the pestilent throng. Everywhere, The droning tally of misery was felt. Corpse mountains burned as Imperial authorities strove in vain to stem the tide of corruption that was drowning their worlds, until at last each planet in turn fell wholly into the grip of Nurgle. It was these pox-riddled systems that Mortarion, demon primarch of the Death Guard, claimed as his staging post for the invasion of Ultramar and his return to real space, and from there that he launched his initial veiled sorties before his final offensive commenced. 3 loathsome spearheads pushed into Ultramar, attacking along 100 fronts and bringing with them unnatural pestilence. The defenders of Ultramar, Astartes and mortal alike, fought bravely but quickly lost ground. Ultramarine Primaris Space Marines of the Ultima Founding arrived not long after the successful completion of the resurrected Primarch Robut Guilliman's Terran Crusade from the throne world aboard Fleet Avenger to aid their firstborn brethren, but even these transhuman reinforcements could only slow the attackers' progress. By CE 111, M42, over 100 standard years after the start of the Indomitus Crusade, the Imperial defenders all across Ultramar were depleted in dozens of ground campaigns, while a plague fleet systematically destroyed the realm's Ultramar defense fleet and star fortresses. Guilliman returned from the Indomitus Crusade after over a standard century of campaigning to stabilize the Imperium, and his deft and defensive maneuvers bought time to launch what became known as the Spear of Espandor counterattack. The combined plague armies were eventually fought to a standstill amongst the ruins of IAX, before Mortarion escaped with his forces back to the Scourge Stars under cover of a virus bomb attack, both because of his brother's staunch defense and because Nurgle's realm in real space had come under assault by the forces of the Blood God Khorne. In a brief respite from the work of safeguarding the Emperor's realm after Mortarion's defeat, Guilliman ordered the rebuilding and decontamination of Ultramar, as well as the establishing of new procedures for creating further Ultramarines. It was not long before new Imperial Crusades called the Lord Commander of the Imperium away from Ultramar and back out into the Dark Galaxy. The Ultramarines then began the work of preparing their vengeance against the servants of the Dark Gods. Before they were reunited with their Primarch, the Dusk Raiders conformed very closely to the standard raiment of arms and organizational patterns laid out for the early Space Marine legions by the Imperial Officio Militaris. At its most fundamental level, the Dusk Raiders Legion was organized around the principle of equipping its individual Space Marines as well as possible, so that they could endure and prevail against any foe encountered and operate for extended periods without resupply or support if necessary. This dogma was the cornerstone of the Eftiandith Legion's way of war and was built upon the foundations of independence and surety with which the Dusk Raiders had always fought. The Dusk Raiders are noted in the Imperial records of this period as maintaining a well-rounded capacity for unleashing multiple modes of warfare, although with some bias towards heavy assault formations and attritional engagements, as evidenced by the particular use of close-ranged weaponry within the Legion. The Dusk Raiders Legion relied upon its infantry to provide its strategic strength, with the bulk of tactical fire support coming from heavily armed support squads, and later with considerable numbers of Terminators and Dreadnoughts providing reinforcement and an assault spearhead where needed. Once Mortarion became the master of the Eftimnith Legion, the Death Guard changed dramatically, including its arts of warfare. Mortarion was at his heart an infantryman, and in his Death Guard he saw the chance to perfect the principle of the utilitarian warrior on foot who could go anywhere, fight on any ground and destroy any enemy through resilience, resolve, and implacable aggression. As part of this doctrine, the Death Guard squad formations were largely not static as in most Space Marine legions of the time, but were formed, reformed, and ordered as needed, and as the given tactical situation required. To this end, a Death Guard legionary was trained to be equally adept at any infantry role he might be called upon to perform on the battlefield, rather than fighting at all times in a particular specialized role. In this way, a Death Guard Astartes would act as a tactical marine in one battle, a heavy weapons fire support specialist in another, and so on, with only tech marines and other highly specialized occupations remaining wholly dedicated to a single tactical role. The Death Guard was organized around the principles established by the Dusk Raiders and built upon the ways they had always fought. Bolter, Melta, and Flamer became the Death Guard's trinity of weapons around which their war gear was based, keeping supply needs to a minimum. Other types of ranged weapons were deployed sparingly, only as the tactical situation or nature of the enemy demanded. Each Death Guard also carried a close combat blade as well, which included broad trench daggers, war scythes, and the heavy slashing Kukra native to Barbarus. Forged of dense black serum steel, these brutal and efficient weapons soon became the hallmark of the Astartes of the 14th Legion. This reliance on simple but effective tools of war was an outward manifestation of the cardinal belief held by the Legion that the Space Marine himself was the greatest of all weapons at the Imperium's disposal, a tireless engine of war before which any enemy would eventually succumb. The Death Guard continued to rely throughout the Great Crusade almost exclusively on its infantry to provide its strategic strength, with the bulk of tactical support firepower coming from heavily armed support squads, and later from the Legion's considerable numbers of Terminators and Dreadnoughts, which provided reinforcement and assault spearheads where needed. This focus on heavy infantry formations was also one of the reasons the Death Guard Legion developed a particularly admirable record in fighting to clear space hulks of alien infestation and for their ability to destroy fortifications and citadels from within. While the Death Guard did utilize field armor, support vehicles, and transports, as Mortarion would not allow his forces to be circumvented, cut off, or left wanting for their lack, these were not given any primacy in the Legion's tactical doctrine. The only exception to this were dedicated siege units, such as the Vindicator, which was fielded in disproportionately high numbers by the Legion, alongside squadrons of Fellblade super heavy tanks and Land Raider Spartans in mass warfare. It was notable in hindsight, and would prove to be a telling factor on Istvan III, that a proportionately high number of the Death Guard Legion's war machine crews were still of Terran blood by the time of the Horus Heresy, while the heaviest infantry strike units, particularly the Legion's sizable corps of Terminator armor-equipped shock troops, were of Barbarus stock. Unlike some of the Space Marine legions whose operations were often diffused across separate commands, task forces and campaigns spread across the galaxy during the Great Crusade, the Death Guard were accustomed to fight as a single, united force. As such, when the 15th Legion came to the Istvan system at the start of the Heresy with almost its entire strength, the most accurate accounts of the time claimed that the Death Guard maintained approximately 95,000 Space Marines, 70 capital ships, and perhaps 3 times that number of smaller escort and assault craft. With the conclusion of the bitter fighting on Istvan III, it is estimated Mortarion's Legion had been reduced by well over 25,000 casualties, counting both the stubborn Terran loyalists, betrayed to their deaths in the ash-mantled ruins of Istvan III, and Mortarion's sons of Barbarus, whose lives had been spent to purchase their demise. It is believed that protracted fighting during the Istvan III atrocity had exacted a heavy toll on the Death Guard's armored divisions, many of which had been amongst the suspected loyalists within the Legion. Though it is believed many vehicles had been recovered from the planet, very little time had been available to render them fully battle-worthy again. However, the fighting that was to occur during the drop site massacre engagement was to suit the Death Guard Legion well, with its strong emphasis and preference on attritional warfare and close-order infantry tactics. Evidence suggests that a large corps of Death Guard legionaries deployed to one flank of the Urgal Fortress line into a network of trenches, bunkers, and slip tunnels swiftly but expertly prepared or augmented by the Legion. This provided them both with deep protection from bombardment and hid their numbers. When the newfound Primarch Mortarion was given command of the 15th Legion, he remade it as a single instrument of his will. Of all the Space Marine legions, it was said of the Death Guard that they were but one entity with a single purpose and one body. The 15th Legion was reordered into 7 great companies of considerably larger size than the standard Astartes Legion organizational structures of the Great Crusade era mandated. Obedience and order in the ranks of the Death Guard was absolute, and an unbroken chain of command ran like blood in the Legion's veins. Legionaries were extensions of their sergeants' will, sergeants their captains, and captains their commanders, while collectively the Astartes of the Death Guard were all instruments of Mortarian body and soul. Few other ranks or divisions of formal organization existed in the 15th Legion, except in very specialized, often technical roles. Each member of the Legion knew his place and the seniority and tasks of those around them without recourse to excessive heraldry and symbol. While many legions had the tradition of giving the honorific of First Captain to the commanding officer of the elite First Great Company, the Death Guard also held two more privileged titles to be bestowed upon the commanders of the Second and Seventh Great Companies, respectively. Thus, although they held no actual seniority over one another, the captain of the Second Great Company could carry the rank of commander if he so wished, just as the captain of the Seventh Great Company was known as the Battle Captain. All Death Guard Astartes conformed to Mortarian's decree without rancor or dissent, and rivalries and internal strife were observed by outsiders to be few, particularly in comparison to more notably fractious legions such as the Night Lords or Space Wolves. When an officer died in battle, his successor stepped into his place swiftly and decisively, without need for orders or discussion, and so the Legion's chain of command was seamless even in the face of the heaviest losses, contributing to the Death Guard's reputation for endurance in war. Attrition rates within the Death Guard Legion on active service were frighteningly high despite their legendary resilience. Indeed, for many years of the Great Crusade, only the World Eaters and Iron Warriors legions were on occasion recorded to have spent more lives proportionately to their strength in pursuit of the Imperium's conquest. Barbarus itself, in a short span of Terran years, became little more than a factory to produce new recruits for the Death Guard Legion, an intake from other sources of recruitment to which the Legion had title dwindled to a mere handful, unless the pressure of combat losses proved too great. Mortarian's resistance to the use of bloodstock other than that of Barbarus wavered only because of the need to keep his Legion's strength battle-worthy, according to his own high standards. Recruitment solely from Barbarus was, however, aided by the high suitability of the planet's feral population for the Astartes conversion process. Following the Death Guard's corruption and Mortarian's ascension to demonhood after the Legion took refuge in the Eye of Terror following the Siege of Terra, the Legion began to splinter into smaller forces called war bands, although the Plague Marines still endeavor to organize themselves into multiples of 7, Nurgle's sacred number. What few vehicles remained to the Legion went unmaintained, sustained either by demonic possession or controlled by packs of Nurglings. However, with Mortarian's return to active leadership of the Death Guard following the opening of the Great Rift in 999. MM41, a more formal Legion organization, re-emerged. Now, in the era Indomitus, the Death Guard are amongst the most ordered and coherent of all the surviving traitor legions. Mortarian, ever a traditionalist, still bases their structure upon the vast Space Marine legions that fought during the Heresy, though the new formations still revolve around the sacred number of 7. Each of the so-called 7 plague companies that comprise the Post-Heresy Death Guard thus numbers thousands of warriors, utterly dwarfing their equivalent formations amongst the loyalist Space Marine chapters of the late 41st millennium. A fully detailed diagram of the Death Guard Legion's full post-heresy organizational scheme can be seen above. In general, each plague company is further divided into 7 smaller units called sepsis cohorts. Sepsis cohorts number around 700 plague marines, supported by infected auxiliaries, armor formations, and demon engine packs. Each sepsis cohort is divided into 2 maledictums, both a formidable fighting force in its own right. The Lord Commander of each plague company, usually a Death Guard Lord or Demon Prince, is the sacred host of one of Nurgle's vilest diseases, and the 7 sepsis cohorts that serve him are its most favored vessels. In turn, each maledictum is divided into 7 colonies. Colonies number 7 squads of 7 traitor legionaries led by a powerful Death Guard Lord, and accompanied by lesser Chaos champions of Nurgle, armored vehicles, attendant demons, and demon engines. The first colony of each Sepsis cohort's maledictums often consists solely of Blightlord Terminators, much like a standard Space Marine chapter's elite First Company. For all its theoretical cohesion, in reality the Death Guard Legion is still broken up like most Chaos Space Marine formations across thousands of galactic war zones, often at the whims of Chaos Lords, Chaos Champions, and the like. These warbands vary hugely in size and composition, but all are known as Vectoriums. Those that fight together for any length of time will be named by their leader, and will often adopt, or simply manifest, a unifying color scheme. Most Vectoriums are drawn from the maledictums or colonies of the same plague company, but some can be more disparate still. Typical Death Guard Vectorium warbands include so-called plague colonies comprised of standard plague marines, destroyer colonies of similar troops equipped with alchemical weapons, and reaper colonies of squads mounted in armored transport vehicles. Alongside phalanxes of battle tanks and monstrous demon engines that regularly fight under their command, the Lords of the Death Guard can also call upon many other heavily armored assets and deadly constructs to support their legionaries in battle. The corruption of chaos is insidious, and amidst the filth and horror of war, many Astra Militarum regiments have sold their souls to Nurgle. Such turncoats bring with them entire divisions of powerful battle tanks and, on occasion, even behemoth super-heavy war engines such as Baneblades and Stormswords. Daubed with heretical slogans, festooned with gruesome trophies, these tainted battle tanks grind the foes of the Death Guard into the dirt. Through torment or madness, the noble knights of the Imperium also fall, on occasion, to the worship of Nurgle. A knight is a 40-foot-tall bipedal war engine, a swift and deadly bringer of death whose limbs and shoulders mount devastating weapon systems. Each machine is operated by a single warrior who is wired into the throne mechanicum at the knight's heart. Should a knight transgress against his noble house, he will be exiled as a free blade, and it is these lonely and tormented individuals who most often fall to the temptations of chaos. Even one Chaos Knight can rip through an enemy formation, while on those rare occasions when entire households fall, the Death Guard gain a terrifying force of allied war engines that can crush entire armies. Greater and more terrifying still are the corrupted god machines of the traitor Titan legions. Though these towering abominations are rare, even a single such engine can change the course of a campaign. From the swift and deadly Warhound-class Scout Titans to the walking fortresses known as Warlords. The strangest and most arcane of all the Death Guard's allies are the secretive Magi of the Dark Mechanicum. Once servants of the divine Omnissiah, these tainted tech priests have abandoned their faith in exchange for forbidden secrets and dark lore. Those that worship Nurgle have learned the secrets of the living rust, viral scrap code, and the countless machine poxes of the Engine Flayer tomes. They use this abominable wisdom to fashion monstrous engines of flesh, metal, and demonic energy. Such cursed war machines rumble into battle, powered by soul furnaces, fed upon diseased corpses, and unleashing eldritch weaponry that obliterates all before them. The members of the Death Guard are also known as Plague Marines. As a result of their servitude to Nurgle, they are rife with all manner of deadly diseases, which renders them immune to pain. In practical terms, this makes them harder to wound and kill than other Chaos Space Marines. While all members of the Death Guard are Plague Marines, not all Plague Marines are of the Death Guard Legion. Other Chaos Space Marine armies may field Plague Marines as part of their forces. Plague Marines under the tutelage of Mortarion know how to win a battle through sheer attrition. Because Mortarion intended for the Death Guard to rely heavily on infantry, the Death Guard are short some measure of fast assault vehicle and heavy weapons. As a result, Death Guard astartes without Terminator armor normally have to settle for special weapons such as the Meltagun and Plasma Gun to replace heavy weapons such as lascannons and autocannons. Also, because the Death Guard are an infantry-based force, A Death Guard warband can be made up solely of heretic Astartes with no armored vehicles or demons in its midst, while still functioning as well as any other Chaos force that is better equipped. The average Death Guard Astartes can lay down a heavy rain of bolter shells while still standing his ground if charged. Many Plague Marines, particularly those who were originally members of the Death Guard Traitor Legion, still prefer to wear the Mark III iron pattern suits of power armor first used during the Great Crusade. Even though more modern marks of power armor had become available to them before the Horus Heresy, the Death Guard retained a large stockpile of the heavier Mark III pattern, preferring it both for its durability and the ease with which they could customize it to better handle the rigors of the often toxic battle zones in which the Legion excelled. The armor of Plague Marines, regardless of its type, usually suffers from severe corrosion and structural breaches over its millennia of service with a corrupted Astartes. Plague Marine power armor is often further modified with the inclusion of a heretical pattern open vent reactor backpack and blasphemous iconography, as well as swelling or even cracking like a broken eggshell to contain the grotesquely mutated physique of its wearer. When the 14 Legion was still known as the Dusk Raiders, its Astartes' signature strategy had been to attack their foes at nightfall, thus earning them their Legion moniker. The Dusk Raiders' power armor was an unpainted slate, gray in color, while their right arm and one or both shoulder plates were painted crimson. This was done with the intent to symbolically show their enemies what they truly were: the Emperor's red right hand, relentless and unstoppable. Many enemies would throw down their weapons the moment the sun dipped beneath the horizon rather than dare to fight them. With the coming of Mortarion, the Legion's combat doctrines changed as the Death Guard became a single instrument of his will. The Death Guard came to believe that victory came through sheer relentlessness. Their weapons, while not ornate, functioned without flaw. They did not maneuver in fanciful patterns to confuse the enemy. Instead, they stood their ground and waited for the enemy assaults to falter before striking back with fatal force. Any environment or situation Mortarion and his advisors could not compensate for, the Death Guard would overcome through sheer stubborn resilience and painful endurance. Mortarion had learned the art of warfare on a world almost covered in mountainous terrain, and even though his innate intellect allowed him to grasp the proper use of tanks and armored vehicles, the primacy of the foot soldier remained the Death Guard's trademark. Each Space Marine was well trained in a variety of infantry disciplines and was able to function in almost any role or environment. The Death Guard were arguably the most remorseless and among the most feared of the Space Marine legions. This was not simply because of their power in battle or force of arms, but also because there seemed to be no loss they would not accept to ensure eventual victory and no hell they would not endure to reach their foe. Although specializing in entrenched and attritional warfare, the Legion also had a number of formations and tactics that enabled it to operate in concentrated and crushing force in an attack. One such was dubbed the Reaping by those who had fought alongside the Death Guard during the Great Crusade, a heavily reinforced column of attack particularly suited to urban warfare and shattered landscapes. The Reaping was deliberately slow-moving and utterly murderous in its methodical assault pattern, and, like the Reaper's scythe, little escaped it. After the Death Guard was transformed by the Plague God and turned into a legion of Plague Marines, they preferred to engage in short-ranged firefights, where they could see the festering wounds inflicted upon their enemies whilst they shrugged off the bolts and last blasts directed back at them. Their decaying brains are inured to the agony of the bodily corruption that runs rampant in their diseased carcasses, making them all but immune to the pain or discomfort caused by battle wounds. When their enemies close within assault range, Plague Marines make use of their blight grenades and release the virulent toxins that they contain, which proceed to eat away at armor and fill the air with thick, noxious clouds of blinding pathogenic spores. The most virulent and flamboyant of these blight grenades are made from the severed, decaying heads of their fallen enemies. Barbarus was a feral world which orbited near its dim yellow sun in the segmentum tempestus, which created a thick, miasmic atmosphere of toxic chemicals. The most virulent of these gases rose through Barbarus's perpetual clouds towards the heat of its star, making the world beneath a dismal place of night, unbroken by starlight and with short, shadowy days. An atmosphere breathable by humans existed only in the lowest elevations, on flat moors and in the valley basins of the jagged stony mountains which spined the world. Unknown alien beings immune to the toxic soup of the planet's higher atmosphere existed on Barbarus, building great keeps of gray stone in the mountain fastnesses. When humans first settled Barbarus, the horrific environmental conditions from which they had to eke out survival quickly reduced them to a pre-feudal state. The higher beings' incomprehensible warp-based powers, their ability to survive where humanity could not, and above all their hunger to prey upon, experiment with, and accurse humankind, caused the settlers to ascribe to those beings a medieval supernaturalism. The true nature of these dark overlords, beyond their obvious connection to the dark entities of the Empyrean, will likely never be known. Barbarus is assumed to have been destroyed by an exterminatus order issued by the Inquisition after the end of the Horus Heresy, like all the other worlds belonging to the traitor legions. Mortarion has crafted a new home from a demon world called the Plague Planet within the Eye of Terror, which resembles ancient Barbarus, Mortarion's original homeworld, remade in yet more hideous hues, a fume-wreathed nether hell where disease runs rampant and barbarian tribes cling to a nightmarish existence amidst rotting forests and swamps. Worm-eaten mountains rise to pierce the churning skies, their flanks roamed by plague-ridden abominations that should be dead yet still prey on human flesh. Higher atop the peaks, the Death Guard maintain their fortresses as once the carrion lords of Barbarus ruled from on high, reveling in the bitter irony that they have become the very despots they once fought to depose. The clouds of contagion that wreathe these slab-sided rusting fastnesses are inimical to life. None but the Death Guard can endure even a single breath of them. Quite besides the brutish batteries of orbital guns that stud every single mountaintop of this world, its vapors alone have proved enough to massacre invading armies on more than one occasion. The Plague Planet is replete with hideous spectacles and places of foetid power. Amongst the suppurating valleys rise tri-lobed platforms of rusted iron upon which mortal tribal champions battle for the right to join the Death Guard's ranks. Hanging in orbit are chained rings of biomechanical defense platforms and suppurating orbital docks at which the plague fleets suckle like flies on a carcass. Shrines to Nurgle, crawling molluscoid fortresses, smog-spewing plague factories, and crackling alchemical shield generators dot the planet's surface. The world's mortal citizens cower in tiny villages, serving their supreme masters of the Death Guard, who reside in mighty fortress citadels far above all of them. Greatest of all, though, are the 7 mountaintop keeps of the Death Guard's plague companies, one company ruling over each in their own uniquely revolting fashions. The largest of these, known as the Black Manse, stretches between the 3 highest peaks of the Plague Planet and serves as Mortarion's personal keep. The dungeons and laboratories of this nightmarish fastness conceal horrors of the very darkest kind. The beliefs of the Death Guard before the outbreak of the Horus Heresy echoed those of their Primarch. At the heart of their core beliefs before the heresy was the unshakable determination that mankind should be free of oppression and terror. Such freedom could only be won by destroying those that would shackle and devour humanity. The battle for the future of mankind was one that could only be achieved through the endurance of any hardship, no matter how terrible. The liberation of humanity justified the ultimate use of any means. The Death Guard's faith in inner strength, iron will, and unshakable resolution in the face of hardship led to overweening pride, arrogance, and an utter contempt for those they deemed inferior. When Nurgle's rot laid the Death Guard low during their time trapped in the warp before the siege of Terra, their pride and arrogance in their strength and contempt for those they deemed weak was laid bare. The Plague Marines' subsequent surrender to Nurgle left the Death Guard with an incredible depth of self-hatred and despair that only fuels their sole desire: to infect the strong, slay the weak, and bring everyone and everything to rot and ruin. In their eyes, their own debasement would no longer seem as shameful if Nurgle's pestilence dragged the rest of the galaxy down into the same depths of ruin and despair. The arrival of the Primarch Mortarion within the 14 Legion in the later days of the Great Crusade seemed to augment and amplify characteristics that had always been present in the Dusk Raiders to new and unseen extremes, while other aspects of the Legion's established nature fell away like a shed skin. Mortarion possessed a razor-sharp intelligence and flair for organizational simplicity and efficiency. These factors, coupled with the ability to inspire a fanatical loyalty in those of Barbarus blood who viewed him as no less than a near-divine savior, engendered a fanatical loyalty to its Primarch rarely seen in other legions. It was no wonder then that by the time of the Istvan III atrocity, with the majority of the Legion being of Barbaran bloodstock, that their loyalty was to their Primarch first, then their Legion, and to Horus. The majority of the Barbaran-born Death Guard Space Marines were more than willing to spit upon their oaths of fealty to the Emperor of Mankind and cast their lot with their macabre Primarch when the time came, a decision which ultimately encompassed the 14 Legion's doom.